All right, welcome everyone. Today I have with me my guest, Sheela Zelmer. She's a pelvic floor physiotherapist and a women's health coach. So, welcome to this interview, Sheela. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. This is really exciting. Yeah.
So excited to chat with you about today's topic, sex and intimacy, something that's not really talked about very often. And I feel like it kind of gets pushed aside, maybe sometimes even in the in an appointment with a medical doctor. It's not very well talked about, I guess, in general. So there's a bit of stigma around some things. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm a pelvic floor physiotherapist, and as a pelvic floor physiotherapist, my specialty is everything below the waist. So, I deal with men and women that are experiencing, bladder issues, sexual issues, bowel issues, anything that would be internal. And for sure, most of the women that come to see me, I am probably the last person that they've gone to see because they can't bring up the topics. Either they're embarrassed or their healthcare provider doesn't have resources for them. So either they have to wait forever. So, I'm in Ontario. I know you are too. We wait a long time to see our family doctor. And even then, the research shows actually that they are not well versed in talking about sex and sexual issues. And so women are really struggling without a lot of answers.
Yeah. And I feel like this is something that even in my own practice, a lot of people are not really open to talk about. And it's so linked with so many other things. Like it could be linked to musculoskeletal conditions, which is primarily what I see. And I'm sure that's also a lot of what you see. Are there any symptoms or things that maybe we should look out for that might indicate that we need to maybe consult a physiotherapist like you yourself?
Yeah, so I think when we think of sex and intimacy, it's really an activity of daily living, no different than being able to go up and down the stairs, to be able to get groceries, to go for a walk. All of these things that we take for granted, sex falls into that category. And when we are not able to participate in it that way, whether that is because of pain, whether that is because of lack of interest or what have you, all of those things warrant a check. And we can see a whole host of symptoms that a woman might experience that's related to difficulties with intimacy. And the first one is probably pain, right? Like if we have pain with any kind of penetration, then for sure that is a hallmark sign, right? It's very noticeable if we have pain. And sometimes women will have noticed that in their history, they even had pain with inserting something like a tampon or even having a pap. So when we have this kind of pain with any kind of insertion, as well as with sexual activity, you can imagine if it doesn't feel good, I'm not going to want to have it, right? And so it sets up this really unfortunate cycle where it doesn't feel good, so we don't want to have it, so now we have no libido. And some women even go in another direction where they're just grinning and bearing it and having sex more for their partner's sake or what have you, and not sharing. Maybe they feel shame about it. Maybe they feel embarrassed. Or maybe they've talked to their doctor and their doctor says, have a glass of wine, which really isn't a solution to this. So for sure, pain is definitely something that would warrant going to see somebody. But we can also have other kinds of symptoms such as maybe a lack of sensation. Maybe we don't feel much down there. It's hard to feel stimulated. It's hard to have an orgasm. And so these normal sort of sensations that we would be experiencing are not allowing us to enjoy the moment. And again, if we're not enjoying it, you're less likely to want to have it. So that's a real libido zapper. And then the final thing is if there are other limitations, functional limitations that are preventing us from being able to be sexually active. So that could be back pain, hip pain, some of those mobility issues that just will not allow us to either get into the right position or to be able to stay in that position. So any of those things I would say would definitely warrant speaking to somebody about, because those are all signs that something is not quite right, but they're definitely things that can be addressed.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of people don't realize some of those symptoms are not normal. We've just kind of normalized those symptoms. And I like that you explained that they're not normal and they might warrant actually seeing a physiotherapist like yourself. What kind of conditions maybe do you see? Like if people have been diagnosed with certain things that maybe also have been linked to things like low libido or other like women's health conditions that you see that kind of go along with this as well.
Yeah, so for sure, when we think of pain as its own like entity, endometriosis is a common condition. 1 in 10 women will experience endometriosis, and one of the symptoms is pain with intercourse. And so that itself is one condition that we often see. But other situations that are not conditions, but are more just sort of life cycles, are anytime we have a hormonal fluctuation. So when we become pregnant, after delivery, as we're approaching menopause, once our period's done, and that is menopause, all of these times where there are hormonal fluctuations, we're going to notice that the hormones that influence the vagina are going to be affected. And so it's possible that you could experience dryness or pain, or maybe even just a change in sensation. You don't feel as much down there. So that is definitely sort of when we tend to notice most of these things occurring. But that doesn't mean that it has to be like that. It can be lifelong. We have many women that come to see me, and from the first time they had a period and tried to insert a tampon, they had pain. So there's always been pain in this area. So again, when we look at the history of it, we're kind of trying to put a picture together.
Yeah, and it's true. Like there's so many changes along a woman's life that so many different things can influence that. Whether it's like just because you're young, maybe it's hormones, maybe it's because you were pregnant, or maybe the type of delivery. And I know that sometimes that can kind of mess up everything down there. But what kinds of things do you feel like would be helpful? What is your type of approach to treatment for something like this?
Yeah, so I think when we look at pain with intercourse, or that, so if we sort of classified it as two different things, because pain with intercourse is one thing, but that low libido is another. And one can cause the other, but they're not necessarily the same. And so when we look at things like pain with intercourse, we definitely want to address and make sure that we are addressing the physical component. So what are the pelvic floor muscles like? What is the tissue like? And like you mentioned, after delivery, we might have scar tissue and things like that that needs to be addressed in that respect. But it's not just the vagina. Like we need to focus outside of just the pelvis. We need to look at the whole body, because like I had mentioned before, what is your back mobility like? What is your hip mobility like? What are the nerves like? Because the nerves from our spine go to that area. And if we're having any change in circulation, change in the way the nerve sends its messages, we can also have pain. And so we also need to address like the other lifestyle pieces. You know, it's really challenging to be healthy body wide, okay, if we are not eating well, if we're not sleeping well, if we're not managing our stress, and if we're not moving our body. And so when women come to me, and if they're really struggling with that is uncomfortable, it's got to be more than just the pelvis. It's got to be a whole body approach to get the circulation going, the movement going, and to really optimize their health. So that's like that physical side of things. But then there's also this sort of a mental, emotional side of it. And sex, unlike other things like, say, knee pain, it is such an emotional thing. Like we come into our sexual relationship and our sexual identity with a whole host of baggage. It is the culture around us, our upbringing, our lived experiences. All of these things influence how we feel, and you cannot separate one from the other. And so it's a very, very complex thing, and you need to really address all of it, because I think if you ignore that piece, the the psychosocial part of that, biopsychosocial aspect, you really miss a massive piece of a person's being. And so really the approach we take is to kind of address all of that, because I think with just addressing things physically, and typically when you go to a family doctor, that's the approach, right? They either give you hormones or a lube and they're just focusing on the pelvic floor. It's not enough, right? It doesn't give any lasting results. But that's just for the pain piece. The libido piece, again, is massive. Like, and libido is physical, it is emotional, and it is relational. And so again, like addressing some of those same things I just talked about, but really getting into communicating how we feel, communicating what we need, what we don't need, and that vulnerability and courage to go there in the conversations.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think the communication piece is so important, especially when you're in a relationship with someone else. And obviously, they can't read your mind. They don't really know what's going on with you. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess it affects those intimate relationships, both not even just with a sex and intimacy perspective, but overall.
Yeah, for sure. I think when we are brave to be vulnerable in that relationship, like imagine a new relationship or a new relationship, um, any of these kinds of times that we are in a transition, there's a lot of courage that's involved, but that's where the beauty and the growth is. That's where deep roots form. And I think that courage is sort of multifold. First of all, you benefit from it's a gift to yourself, right? That you know that you've spoken up for yourself, that you are seen and that you are heard. And then it's a gift to the other person because, like you said, they can't read your mind. So now they know. I often say to women that many times our partners would be more than happy to do something that they knew would help you have more desire. So if we communicate that to them, it really does make a big difference, right? And they're happy to say, yes, I'll do what it would take in order for you to feel more desire and more arousal. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that probably relates to a much happier, healthier relationship.
Yes, totally, totally. Yeah, for sure. And again, the ability to communicate that also is part of our history, our upbringing. My personal history brought up very modest, very conservative, and so to communicate some of these things was just outside my comfort zone, right? And it took a lot of years with my spouse in order to be able to do that. And so it is not easy, like anything, right, in the beginning, but it gets better the more we do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Just be brave. And I feel like a lot of when we're vulnerable, especially, a lot of good things come out of those things. It's just
Yes, for
hearing.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive a little bit deeper into libido. I feel like this is something that there's a lot of like misconceptions about it. I feel like a lot of people just assume it has to do with their hormones and there's nothing they can do about it. At least this is what I've come across. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things we can do, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the interesting thing about research is that they found that our libido is not tied to hormones, and it is also not tied to the length of time we've been in a relationship. I think sometimes we kind of fall into those two categories, thinking, well, I don't have it anymore. I've been with this guy for 20 years, or whatever it is, right? So the research shows that that's not the case. It shows that actually, the longer you're with someone, you tend to have deeper intimacy and everything like that. Because again, some of these things we've talked about, that vulnerability, that communication. And so when I'm describing libido, I often like to describe it like a car engine, right? We have things that are an accelerator and things that are a brake. Now, an accelerator are things that make our desire increase, and brakes are things that put the brake on our desire. And oftentimes women will believe that they don't have enough accelerators, like they're not turned on easily or what have you. But the research again shows that it's not that we don't have enough accelerator, it's that we have too much brake, right? So if we think of a car and the brake is on, it doesn't matter how much gas you give it, that car is not going to go anywhere, right? And so when we take a look at that, we need to really understand what are the things that turn our desire off. And they can kind of be classified in a couple of categories. So one of them is sort of like emotional and bonding categories, right? So things that make us feel safe and connected, things that make us feel seen by our partner. So the example I often give is, every morning, my husband makes sure that my favorite mug is cleaned, washed, and dry and ready for my coffee. It has nothing to do with intimacy, but that's a sign that he knows me, that he sees me, that I start my day with my favorite mug that he's made sure has been washed and everything like that. And so that's the kind of stuff, that emotional bonding piece. There's also really erotic cues, like overtly sexual cues. And for everybody, that's different. Like you can't compare what is exciting to you to what's exciting to your girlfriend, to your sister. All of us are different, but being able to be brave enough to identify what are our erotic cues and contexts that contribute to our desire. We also have visual things, like there are certain things that we find visually attractive, right? So a certain style of dress or grooming or look, and again, being honest about that. Now, the challenge is maybe that's not what our partner looks like. So how do we communicate some of the things that they can change? Like if, you find blonde hair attractive, but your spouse is dark haired, I don't know that that's going to be a match. But again, communicating things, maybe a style of cologne or a style of shirt or something like that, that you find enjoyable and nice to look at. And then the final one is romantic context. When we feel that there is that intimacy that comes from holding hands, or maybe just sitting on the couch and cuddling without any expectation of sex. And when we have breaks, when those things aren't in place, when we are missing that connection, we're missing those erotic cues, we're missing that bonding. And so we need to make sure that we identify the things that are accelerators and brakes so that we can communicate that with our partner.
I love the way you put that, the entire analogy with the accelerators and brakes. And I feel like we probably work on one and kind of ignore the other, but I think we need to maybe have more accelerators and less brakes and work on both sides.
Yeah, totally. Like definitely in order to make the engine go, you got to work on both, but I think the first step, and what I would say to women, is to get curious about yourself. Give yourself permission to ask these questions, like to identify and say what you find erotic, and sometimes we don't know. We've never really thought about it. We're embarrassed to talk about it. We're embarrassed to think about it. So you don't need to share it with anybody necessarily right away, but at least to give yourself that space to ask those questions. Because if we want to build desire, and honestly, desire is no different, and sex is no different than any other health aspect. Like if we want to build a healthy lifestyle, and we're going to then prioritize exercising, we're going to prioritize eating certain kinds of food and not eating certain kinds of food. If we want to have that good physical relationship with our partner, then we need to prioritize this, right? We need to take that time and take that energy and think about, what does it look like to make intimacy a priority in my life?
Mm-hmm. I love that. I want to ask you about Kegels. This is something
Okay.
that I feel like you love talking about because I've heard you talking about it before.
Yes.
Yeah. What are your opinions? Should we do them? Should we not do them?
Okay, so Kegels were named after Dr. Kegel. So he, in the 60s, identified that women, after they have a baby, had changes to their pelvic floor muscle. So he identified a way of measuring. It's almost like a modified blood pressure cuff that he would insert it, these women would squeeze, and he'd be able to see how much pressure they're exerting. And so we call that squeezing in the vagina a Kegel. But the challenge is, just like there is no one exercise that's for everybody, we don't give everybody planks, we don't give everybody burpees, there is no one exercise for everyone. And the truth of the matter is, by far and large, we have more women that experience overactivity of the pelvic floor than we do underactivity of the pelvic floor. Now, both of those could be weakness. So I often give the example of my neck and shoulders. If I'm getting a lot of headaches, if I'm getting some shoulder pain, and my shoulders are hunched up here all the time, these muscles are very firm, but it doesn't mean that they're strong. And so when we think about it, a tense muscle is also a weak muscle. And so we can have instances of weakness and yet be too tense. And so in that case, doing a Kegel where we're squeezing even more is just going to make those concerns worse. And so one thing I will say, if you're experiencing pain, it's probably a good sign that your muscles are too tense. It's rare that you would have pain with a true weakness and underactivity of the muscles. So I feel not everybody should be doing Kegels, and the research shows that 60% of women don't do them properly. So I don't know. I'm kind of I hate to say go do them, because the truth of the matter is the majority of population shouldn't be doing them. So I think it is only if it is recommended by someone who has at least assessed and determined if they're the right exercise for you.
So you heard it from Sheela herself. Make sure you get assessed if you're doing Kegels.
Yes. And it's interesting. I think way back when, I'm going to say in like the 50s and 60s, women were told to do Kegels. And then in the 90s and into the early 2000s, they were told nothing. So you have, older women that have been doing Kegels for decades, And then you have women with school-age children that have not been doing anything. And so the women that have been doing them for decades, they're still having issues because nobody assessed them. They just started doing them. Dr. Oz talks about doing 300 a day. You know, we wouldn't do 300 of any exercise a day. Why all of a sudden in the vagina is that a good idea? So that's the problem with some of those exercises. And so definitely, again, Kegels are not for everybody. There's no one size fits all, and it can definitely make some conditions worse.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So if we are, if I guess most people who are experiencing pain are just really tight in their pelvic floor, are there any things that you, like any of your go-to techniques or tips that we can maybe start loosening things up that are simple?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I think the pelvic floor, it's part of our core. It works synergistically with our abdominal muscles, our back muscles, our diaphragm. So anything that is engaging and relaxing all of those muscles. So yoga sequences are good. And I'm not talking like intense Ashtanga or Vinyasa, but I'm talking restorative, maybe yin, maybe hatha, something very gentle, rhythmic, paying attention to your breathing. That is going to be moving the pelvic floor, because our pelvic floor moves with every breath. Every time we inhale, it relaxes. Every time we exhale, it lifts. So when we are breathing nicely, relaxed, not tense and all up here, but like a nice diaphragmatic breath, the pelvic floor is getting mobilized. So that's for sure number one. And the second thing is, I would say, I think a lot of times as women, and even myself in this talk, I've been talking about the vagina, but our pelvic floor is continuous from the pubic bone in the front to the tailbone in the back. And we need to understand that what's happening in the rectum is part of this. So if you are not pooping every day, you're going to have tension in the pelvic floor, because that stool is occupying space and it requires muscle activity to hold it there. So really letting that all go. I have a model here. I'm just going to show it to you. Can you see that here? Okay, so this is a woman's pelvis. She's lying on her back. This is her tailbone here. This is her pubic bone at the top. So we have the vaginal opening here and the rectal opening here. But we do not have separate muscles around the vagina and around the rectum. They go across both. So whatever happens to the rectum is going to influence what happens in the vagina. So if you're having tightness, pain, bladder leakage, and you're worried about what's happening more towards the front, you need to make sure you're thinking about what's happening in the back too. So those are probably the two big things. Keep moving, breathing well, and stay regular.
Amazing. And I talk about all of those things with my people all the time.
Amazing.
It helps
Yes.
with everything.
For sure, totally. Yeah. And that's the thing with all of these healthcare recommendations. What's good for our pelvic health is good for our musculoskeletal health, our heart health, our brain health, our bone health. Like, it's good for everything. It's all the same. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no like special fancy thing that you have to do. It's just coming back
No,
down to the basics. I love that.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, I don't know if I have any other questions for you, but are there any other things that you would like to talk about that maybe we missed?
No, I just would want to end with, if you have any concerns, if you feel like you are having any pain or a lack of sensation or a lack of libido, don't wait. These are not things that get better with time. These are not things that are just going to go away on their own. In fact, they can worsen over time. And so seek out help. You know, we do have to advocate for ourselves in some respects. If you're not getting good answers with your primary healthcare provider, look outside of that. There is great info that is out there, and there are people that can help and put the pieces of this puzzle together. So I would say just don't ignore it. That's the big thing.
Amazing. And I know you have a free libido guide and people
Mm-hmm.
can download that. So we'll put a link up to that. And
Amazing.
if anyone wants to learn more about what Sheela does, you can join her free Facebook community, and that will probably provide you with a lot more content and a lot more about this topic as well if you're interested. So definitely join that. We'll put a link down below as well. Um, Anywhere else we should send people? Do you want them to send to your like Instagram account? We can put a link there.
Yeah, I've got an Instagram account too, so I'll put that link up there for you too. You can follow me there, and I try to post like some, health information and health tips that are, again, related to women's health concerns here.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here and answering all of my questions and for all of your knowledge. I love everything that you had to say.
This has been great. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
All right. Well, have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.